Hello, and welcome to Varn blog. And today we're here with Cohen-Sanchez, a grassroots organizer for various progressive campaigns. And we are talking about the organizing space, to use a very loose term, currently in 2024. I feel like progressives are often a little mixed about the landscape of possibility for them right now. So I wonder what you see on the ground and where exactly you're organizing.
So we are organizing all over the country nationwide. But me personally, I'm in Nevada, so I am in a battleground state, in a battleground town. I think that in terms of organizing, I mean, we know that it starts from the bottom up. So we focus a lot on local level races, city council, the legislature, places like that.
And Nevada seems particularly fraught these days. What I was recently there. It's an interesting state in that it's a Western state that is a battleground state. It shares that with New Mexico, but its culture is very libertarian. So how do progressive causes go over there, and what is your angle for grassroots organizing in such a state?
Yeah, so Nevada is a really interesting state, I think, because I'm not sure like how many people are familiar with our like history of the Democratic Party out here. But during the 2016 movement for Bernie, our Democratic Party here locally was actually taken over by the progressive wing of the party. So that happened. We have very stark differences, I think, in terms of outsiders to the party here in Nevada. So a lot of Trump support, a lot of support of candidates like Bernie Sanders, and not a whole lot of the in between, which means that, I think that that's the biggest reason why Nevada has struggled so much in terms of like being one way or the other.
So what conditions in Nevada would lead to, say, a lot of support for very progressive causes in what would culturally and industry-wise seem like a pretty red state? I know it isn't, but
yeah. Well, I mean, so I think like it's really about like the inside and the outside of the party here, and people, and like as you mentioned, very libertarian, right? Which is always interesting to me because I feel like Trump is like so opposite of a libertarian candidate, but there is that populist message I think that people sometimes mix up with like limited government. Some of the more progressive causes here that I think people like champion are things like abortion. We are definitely a sanctuary state, and like that has never been really brought up as like something that Republicans want to take away from women. Issues like that where there's more so like limited government.
Why would Bernie Sanders be popular in that, or not that he has regressive views on abortion or anything, but it still seems hard to square.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really just think that people here are sort of sick of the status quo, right? Like the establishment Democratic Party is not something that people really gravitate to out here. A big part of that, I think, is that we do have a lot of migration from California, and typically people that are moving to Nevada are not people necessarily that believe in, that California is a great state. So we do get a lot of those people that come over here looking for quote unquote more limited forms of government.
So can we talk about, say, wealth patterns in Nevada and the West? Nevada seems particularly interesting. I mean, I was recently in Vegas for a wedding, and costs there are dramatically different than, say, costs in Utah, which are expensive but consistently so. Whereas in Nevada, it's actually very hard to predict prices, even well off the tourist areas in the Strip. So what kind of concerns are working families having out there right now?
Well, I mean, definitely cost of living is one of them. I mean, even though like Utah is, I would say, certainly less expensive. Well, depending on where you are, right? But Nevada has definitely gone up significantly, particularly in our cities. So like Las Vegas, we've had a massive increase in housing cost over the last 5-6 years. So much so that in a lot of places it's even doubled, which is really, hurt working families. Certainly our food cost has gone up because of the cost of import and export. As everybody knows, Nevada is not exactly like the best place to grow food. It is a desert essentially. So, but what you do see in like places like Las Vegas, and why I believe Las Vegas and places like Reno have stayed blue, are really the tourist industry and how many people work in the tourist industry. So we have a lot of folks that are very, very much working class and relying on tips and relying on, tourists to come in and enjoy our state. And so I think that that really has driven places like Las Vegas and Reno blue.
So what is organized labor like in Nevada? I actually am surprised being a union guy myself that I don't know, but I don't. So
yeah, it's very strong. Like our culinary union is extraordinarily strong, and that was a big piece of why Bernie Sanders did so well, was that like the culinary union had endorsed like fairly early and really got out the vote for him in a really strong way. I think that there were definitely like other reasons why Bernie did extraordinarily well here, but certainly the culinary union had a big piece to do with it.
So in your experience, would you find that moderating towards the center probably doesn't actually help Democrats and progressives or any kind of leftist at all in a place like Nevada? And I know that's kind of a leading question, but you could just tell me no. But does centrist politics have a lot of appeal, particularly considering the reputation of California?
Yeah, I think like on the federal level, yes. But I think locally less so. And I think it really obviously depends very much on like where you're running, because there are definitely places in Nevada that I think the establishment message works a lot better than in other places. But I think primarily it hasn't, we only just got hit, I think, with like the MAGA train fairly recently in terms of losing a lot of our seats. So like now we have Sam Brown, who's running for US Senate, who's like extraordinarily MAGA, Trump loyalist, and we have others too here, particularly like our governor, as most people know. So I think that it really depends on like where you're running in Nevada. But I think generally speaking, the progressive message versus not even the progressive message, the anti-establishment message does very, very well out here.
Right. So we see moderation on the national level, but not at the local level, on both sides, probably. Well, I ask because it seems like a lot of people's instincts is to moderate on the state level, or on all levels, in purplish states. But looking at what I've seen, and I'm originally from the South and I live in Utah now, but that does not necessarily seem to be a good strategy for candidates. And I don't really know if it's a good strategy for advocacy groups. So that's why I'm asking. I often think that we do not take the particularities of the regions, states, and even municipalities that we're in, seriously enough, because most of our news cycle is national now. Do you find the national news cycle to be a problem for progressive organizing?
I think that it's not the main reason why we have so many issues in progressive organizing. I think it's it's definitely a symptom or one of the things that doesn't help. But I don't think it's like the core reason, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I guess that leads me to the next question. What do you think is the core reason?
Reasons. I mean, there are quite a few things, but I think like, first things first is that we have a habit of eating our own. And that's been a problem in the progressive movement, I would think, really like almost since the beginning, or at least like in the modern beginning, right? And like when I say like modern beginning, I'm talking like at least the last 10 years. That has been a big issue. It's like we have a lot of folks that are super far left that don't even believe in electoral politics. Then we have people that are extremely far right of the party, and finding a middle ground there can be very, very difficult. I'm not denying that. The right is a lot better at that. The right is a lot better at coalescing around a message, coalescing around a candidate. Of course, like with Trumpism, there are certainly people that have left the party. There's no doubt about it. But they've left the party, right? Like there isn't this sort of like lingering, I mean, well, I guess there was during the speaker incident, but it seems like at least that at this point, they have decided to get behind Trump. We don't do that as well as the Republicans do. So I think that's the main cause of our struggles. We also don't use fear as a messaging tactic. And so it can be really, really tough when you are trying to fight against that message. You know, when you're trying to fight the big boogeyman of the illegal immigrant coming and taking all your jobs, and we turn around and we say facts, and you know this is a fact and that's a fact, and illegal immigrants aren't actually, you know, the facts don't work as well as the fear tactics do, and so we are always going to be behind just because of that.
We have noticed a change in national level signaling from the Democratic Party in the last couple months, where they have been relying on fear tactics, but I don't know if it's a difference in the nature of the base or what. And I do take psychological profiling as something we should seriously consider on the left, but it does seem like we've moved away from the fear of democracy, which seems to be not as effective as a fear like not to call it fear mongering, but it doesn't seem to work. Or people agree that it's a threat, but they don't, even on the left, they don't agree with why it is a threat, like, or what particular thing is going to be beyond Trump himself as a kind of nebulous demagogue figure, the particular threat. So we've seen a lot of talk about the politics of joy. I have my critique of that, but I do think it does seem to have struck a chord with at least Democratic activists from progressive to slightly left of center. What do you think that is, given that we also know that the fear tactics seem to work for conservatives?
You know, so I think that one of the biggest issues here, and this is no shade on Kamala's campaign at all. I think she's running a fantastic campaign considering the situation that she's in. Like, how many people end up in this situation over the course of history? Not very many, if any, right? So I give her so much credit for that and for her team and everything that they're doing to, I mean, she has risen in the polls, and that was her job, and she's done that successfully. However, I think this whole issue with the disconnect between the Democratic Party and more progressive folks, particularly those that are, not wanting to vote for Kamala, maybe because of her position on Palestine, or not wanting to vote for her position on the police. And I think that this message of joy, I think, particularly angers that group of people, because it just continues to show them that they don't matter in that discourse necessarily. Now, should they change that message? I'm not sure, because honestly, progressives don't vote for the most part. So like, and I've tried to make videos on TikTok about this. Like, when progressives are trying to hold their vote as a protest vote, as somebody that has worked both inside and the outside of the establishment, that doesn't do anything, because they are not target voters. So essentially, like, you're holding your vote as hostage for something that is not, it just doesn't make sense. As if you're not a target person to them, like, why is withholding your vote going to do anything, essentially? So I mean, I think that's the state of it. Like, should they change the message at this point? I don't think so. I think it's too late, but I can understand from the progressive person's perspective that that they might feel sort of annoyed by that message, given that they don't feel joy, even though we do, because a lot of us have been working inside the system, and this is a huge jump from where we were, and we need to acknowledge that there's been that big jump, and in a sense, like, reward the Democratic Party for doing this, because the alternative was extraordinarily bad. The alternative was that they would have kept Joe Biden and we were going to lose the presidency. So the fact that they at least listened, even though it was just the donors at the end of the day, but the donors were listening to the people, because the people had said they're not voting for Joe Biden. So I think that that's still, it's a step forward.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of potential perils for the Harris campaign, but they're doing messaging, they're doing rather well, and we can't really speak about anything beyond messaging yet. The question that I have, maybe a little bit that you hit on, and one that, as a person who is not an anti-electoralist, I'm not, otherwise we wouldn't be talking.
Yeah.
But I am somewhat skeptical of progressives trying to use electoral politics as their means to build their base, for the reason why you said. From a game theoretical perspective, there's nowhere for them to go. Either they're not going to vote, so they're going to hold a protest vote, or they are going to vote, and who are they going to vote for? Mm-hmm. Right? And running third-party candidates, particularly after state-level reforms post-Ross Perot, is stupid, for lack of a better word. And I know a lot of people would not expect me to say that, but it's also, it has the theory of political change kind of backwards. It's a very, weirdly, for people who are grassroots oriented, it's actually a very top-down view of how politics works. Like, if we just change the head of the snake, the entire snake will change.
Right. And
even with the GOP and Trump, that wasn't immediately true. That's been an 8-year plus process. Yeah. So if you are progressive right now of any stripe, where would you tell people to devote their energy to building a longer view of systemic change?
Yeah, that's a good, so I mean, really, like, what we have to do is we have to change the way in which we vote. So we have to champion ranked choice voting and start voting in states, because when we do that, that's when we start to see actually real primaries, right? And this has been a big complaint amongst, I mean, not just progressives, to be honest, like amongst more than just progressives. I mean, even folks that work in the establishment have been frustrated with this, about how there's always this idea of like fake choice, right? And then, like, for example, we already knew going into this presidential election that Joe Biden was not liked. That was very clear. Could we have had a primary with more than just like unserious third party style candidates? Of course, we could have had a legitimate primary, and we could have championed that person that won, and then we would have been in a much better situation. And what we've seen time and time again is that we have these like sort of what we call like show primaries, right? Like, they don't really matter. The party picks somebody and that's the person they're going to champion, whether they win the primary or not. But when you start changing that at the local level, when you start having ranked choice voting, it's no longer the party's decision at that point, right? Like, ranked choice voting really changes the game. And so, sure, are there ways that they could disrupt that? I mean, of course, I think, like, of course, right? But like, seeing the way that this has been adapted by cities, we have a lot more working class electeds getting elected to office now than we ever have before. And so that's something that I highly encourage anyone who is frustrated with the system to do, is to get involved in passing those measures.
Well, one thing I've always thought about movement conservatism in a way is that they tend to go where the barriers to entry are low. School board seats, rural districts where you don't need $1 million to run for city council. Mm-hmm. Progressives, by and large, don't seem to do that. Why do you think?
Well, I think that a lot of them don't live in those areas, so I think that's a big part of it. But also, I think that there sort of becomes this like disillusion with the system, and I think that this happens with everyone, not just progressives, but I think more so with progressives. That we start to look at the system as, well, it only matters what happens at the presidency level, or it only matters what happens at the US Senate level. And that's just not true. I mean, and that's something that we really have to get through to people, is that so much of our decisions and so much of our community happens at the school board level. And so many of these seats never go challenged, right? As you said, like there are seats that we haven't had a Democratic challenger for in 30 plus years, right? Like, and it's not that these areas are too red to win. Like you can flip any red district with the right strategy, the right money, and the right message. But people don't even try. And then they're really, and that's what I don't understand, is that there's so many people so frustrated with the system, but yet not willing to run for school board, yet not willing to pass a ballot measure, yet not willing to do anything that's actually going to make the system better, other than just withholding their vote as if that's going to do something.
All right. So let's say you are progressive in a rural area and you get voted to, I don't know, like the Chamber of Commerce or the Port Authority or something small.
Yeah.
I have known people to do this and succeed, even independents, not just Democrats, but often even if they're Democrats, what they discover is there's no, they don't know how to do the job, basically. They got elected to something and they don't entirely understand what they got into, and there's not a lot of support for them. So where would you point for people to find support or to build those support networks?
Yeah, so that's a big issue that we have with the Democratic Party, I think, as a whole, is that there are big gaps in infrastructure to even be able to support people. So I think a lot of people, like I hear a lot of people complaining when they're running for office that they don't have a structure for the Democratic Party, but then like they've never volunteered or they don't know anybody that's ever volunteered. And a lot of these chapters do not have money. It's not like they're flooded with money with full-time staffers. Most of these Democratic chapters, especially in rural areas, some of them don't even have a chapter. Others like have like part-time unpaid volunteer folks that are running them. And so there's not that infrastructure already set up. So what I would encourage folks to do is to reach out to first find out if you even have a Democratic Party infrastructure in the first place. And if you don't, like start a working group to get something started. If you don't have that kind of time and you are passionate for running for office, and there are other organizations that can help you do that. Like our organization, we put on a lot of free seminars and webinars for first-time candidates to help them to get to know the process. There are other organizations too, like Emerge, which is fantastic if you're a woman candidate. They have great training programs. Emily's List, for sure, especially if you're running for federal office and you're a woman. Latinas Represent. I mean, there's so many of them. And I actually have a link tree in my bio on my TikTok if anybody's interested in going to find those resources.
So to put a little heat on it a little bit, one talking point for the Democratic Party for the past, I don't know, 15 years, since Barack Obama, is a demographics as destiny argument that the diversification of the United States would automatically lead to them being kind of in a semi-permanent majority in most of the country. That talking point has kind of been dropped recently because it's just not entirely happening. And while there has been overstatement, I think, about how conservative, say, Latin voters are, there does seem to be some real movement there in directions that should make progressives a little bit concerned. How would you stem that tide? And what do you think communities of color in Nevada are really concerned about?
Well, I mean, certainly the cost of living is a huge issue. And I mean, yeah, the reality is that it's been a long time since the Democratic Party has had meaningful conversations with really all people of color in this country across all different states. And I think that I think where we're going to see that change over time, and this is why it's so important to get involved locally, is that the younger people that are rising up in the Democratic Party now are very much aware of this, right? As opposed to what we call like the old guard that has maybe been aware of it, but honestly hasn't really cared, to be perfectly frank. So I think that we're going to gradually see that change. But again, if we're going to see it at the pace in which we need to see it, we need to have more people involved that are younger and that are willing to climb the top of the inside to be able to make that change.
I guess one thing I would ask is, while clearly you focus a lot on electoral campaigns, and I do think that's important, even as a fire-breathing radical myself. I would say that there's a couple of things that I think that we should probably zoom in on. The cost of living and stuff like the healthcare crisis, which is now kind of been exacerbated on two fronts. We have the old healthcare crisis, and it costs too damn much money for everybody, including the government. But we have a new healthcare crisis on top of that, which is we don't have enough people to run the system, and tons of money now is going into just maintaining the coding and this, and not into hiring doctors, nurses, compensating for declining Medicare payouts, et cetera, et cetera. How would, in your ideal world, what would you be organizing to do to help that situation? And how do you think that would help prospects for everyone?
So you mean like sort of like trying to change over more so to like a Medicare for all system?
Well, I mean, I would love a Medicare for all system tomorrow, but that's not like I am of the opinion you're going to have to take a couple of baby steps there. Again, even as a fire breathing radical, I saw how quickly people caved on that. And if like you don't have enough doctors and nurses, then Medicare for all doesn't actually necessarily fix all that.
Yeah.
So what kind of things are we looking at? What kinds of things could we be looking at, advocating for, and what would be popular with your constituency?
Well, I think obviously definitely depends on where you're running, but I do think that like making sure that we have people that are able to get into education that is more affordable helps this crisis, right? And this has been a big crisis for a long time. Is college affordability, and not even just college affordability, but like also like 2-year programs, right? Like there's a lot of, I don't believe like to be a registered nurse, but like techs and things like that, like being able to go to 2-year colleges, a lot of that has been unaffordable for people. And I think as we're seeing the rising cost of living, that becomes even more unaffordable for people. So I think if we work towards like a system like they have in New York City now, where if you're a New York City resident, you can prove that you've lived there. I think it's like for 5 years, you get free college tuition at CUNY, the City University of New York. And those are really good schools. Like these are not like bottom of the barrel type schools at all. I mean, they're very highly accredited, amazing universities. So I think that we can work towards a system like that in every state. I think New York is honestly, with all the problems that it has, I think we can really look to it as like a place for us to move forward from, because so much has been able to be changed at the local level in New York that we're seeing these systems. Like we have a Medicaid, a Medicare for all style system in New York City. Yes, it's based on your income, but like very few people don't have health care because we're able to, I think it's like $60,000 or something is like what you have to, like if you make over that like per person, then you have to like contribute. But essentially like we've done so much with ranked choice voting there, with free college tuition if you're a resident, and we need to start moving this like at a national scale from state to state.
Do you think it would be easier to move to a national scale if more state parties adopted such platforms? I mean,
yes, 100%.
Not to put our West Coast Democratic friends on blast, but one thing I have noticed is that the New England Democrats, because of a history going back to the early 20th century, at least the mid 20th century, even before the bankruptcy of New York City, there is, you know, to use economic technical periodization, a kind of Fordist infrastructure that the West Coast does not have. Like, you do not see the same infrastructure in California, even when you see similar policies being attempted, like, you know. And I've been a little worried myself when progressives start talking about using California as a model, for two reasons. One, it's vastly unpopular in the rest of the country, just that state itself. Two, fair or unfair, I mean, I'm not gonna get into that, but, and two, there is a technically neoliberal undergird into a lot of what they do, where they have public-private partnerships that actually end up being very expensive and they don't have the results that New York does, without as many public-private partnerships. That seems a little bit fine-grained for progressives today. Like, when I talk about that, a lot of people kind of their eyes glaze over, but I'm like, you really need to study municipal public policy when you're talking about these things, are state level public policy, because they are different. And we have seen, in the case of New York, there is an attempt by conservative states to break it under the guise of immigration. So one of the reasons why they've been shepherding illegally a lot of migrants to northern cities is you know, to share the cost, but also it's had the effect of trying to break, or at least make unpopular, effective public sector, you know, protections that are municipal or state level. How do we combat that in messaging? Because that does seem to be a serious problem. And even someone, like I said, as radical as me, does not want to see those things dismantled.
You know, I think that, well, one of the issues that we have is that we're not all aligned, I think, on the progressive side on a shared message there. So I think that until that happens, I think it's going to be really, really difficult to make the case to do it. Because honestly, at least from what I see, and I don't know statistically, but there are so many people that don't want to work within the current system, whether it's municipal or otherwise. And so I think it's really hard to, I don't know if we're like at the point where we can make the case yet, if that makes sense.
Okay. So you're working on a lot of grassroots networking, and you're working in Nevada. You obviously have some background in New York. And if you were to say to start building both through the Democratic Party and outside of the Democratic Party, and I have my deep critiques of the donor system of the Democratic Party, but I do realize that if you're going to even make reforms and make more radical politics possible, you're going to have to work with some of these institutions. There's no way around that. And so, what kind of things would you do to link these regional efforts together? Because outside of the Democratic Party itself, and we've already mentioned that on some state levels, and even some surprising places, I have a friend of mine in Miami who told me that, like, that the Democratic Party apparatus there is a lot more poor and broken than I thought it would be, given it's a major metropolitan area. In what used to be a purple state, not anymore. But, well, it could be, though. I mean, that's the thing, is you actually, like, you look at the number of liberal and left-leaning people in Florida, it should not be as crazily red as it is.
They've elected the strongest person ever to Congress, and they say Miami-Dade County could turn blue for Kamala. So it's definitely making strides.
Right. So it does seem that you kind of in a, I think progressives are in a bind, and I want to get you to talk about that bind, because on one hand, you're absolutely right. We attack each other way too much. We attack each other on the far left way too much. We just attack each other way too much. Often because, let's be quite frank, I think a lot of our frustrations are aimed at people that we can't get at, but the people right next to us, we can. But I do think like we're going to have to think about how to work on strategic things with people we disagree with on a wide variety of other issues. And how would you go about instantiating that culture? Because like I said, you're working in Nevada, you obviously are going to have to work with people who might agree with you on like 70% of your worldview, but that 30% they really don't.
Yeah. Yeah. True. Yeah. Well, I think that I think a big part of sort of renovating that culture is that we need to work with young people that don't know anything about this, essentially, right? That are just coming into the fold now, folks that are turning 18. But also like, I think that like this whole, I think that I see at least a lot more joy in the young generation in terms of their hope for the future right now, at least. So I feel very hopeful that we can change that structure with them. But if we're going to do that, we have to take responsibility as the Democratic Party, because really, when I say the Democratic Party is not just the establishment. The Democratic Party, like we've mentioned, are a lot of times in these rural areas, like every working class people who are just volunteering their time because they care about their community. So when we talk about the Democratic Party, I think it's important to mention that it's not just Nancy Pelosi. Like, yeah, she's calling the shots at the top, whatever you want to think. It's probably true. But at the end of the day, like that does not make up nearly what the whole Democratic Party really is. So I think that getting those younger people to continue that hope is really important beyond this presidential race, whether Kamala wins or loses. But then giving them the tools that they need to get involved, because that's been a big issue that we've had, again, because of lack of infrastructure, but like we haven't told people how to do that. So a lot of the times when I'm making content, I think it's really basic. Like everybody should know this information, like how to sign up to run for office, how to start your fundraising journey. Like to me, it feels very simple. But a lot of people don't know this. A lot of people, even that like work within the structure of the Democratic Party, don't know this. So I think it's important for more operatives to give that information for free. And I think that's the only way we change it.
Why don't more operatives give it away for free?
Why? Well, it's a deep, dark question. I mean, I think that the consulting industry, I mean, if we want to get into the consulting industry, there are a lot of issues with the consulting industry. The number one issue is that is primarily almost entirely all men. A lot since 2018, we've seen a slight shift in that. So there are definitely more women that are entering the consultancy space and entering not just in I don't like to use the word just consultancy, because I think that like for example, I think what we do is we're not consulting somebody really. I mean, we're actually staffing their entire race. So I think that there have definitely been more women that have joined, but there's certainly a massive deficit. And also the age skews extraordinarily old. Like the average consultant in this industry, and I don't have the stats for this, but like at least from my own anecdotal experience, is that most consultants are over the age of 60. So that really, it doesn't help to expand this knowledge base, because I mean, why would they give away this information for free if they've always made a shit ton of money doing it? Excuse my French, but it's true, right? Like why would they? Also, like they're consistently rewarded by essentially like it's become a boys club at the top. So essentially like the more people that in this industry, the more well connected you are, which usually takes money, age, being white usually is very helpful. That it really sort of narrows down that it's harder to get people to make money when they enter the space, right? So that's why we don't have a lot of people offering this information for free, because if the barrier to entry was easy, then we'd have a lot more women, I think, doing this work.
Well, I'm just thinking about the Democratic Party of, somebody who would have been 20 in 1980.
Yeah.
And You would have still had the Southern Democratic machines being largely Dixiecrat. You would have had, highly conservative Democrats holding a whole lot of the Southeast. You would have had very old machine politics, which outside of a very few states is not really around anymore. So on one hand, yeah, I could see why they'd hoard the exites for their own monetary gain. On the other hand, I also don't know what they would know about the upcoming electorate, because while, yes, baby boomers do vote more than any other group, as the elderly tend to, and Gen X is getting of age where it's also going to vote, and Gen X leans more conservative than the baby boomers, despite what people think. The polls are pretty clear on that. It does seem like, well, for example, at the current moment, the largest generation in the United States, I think as of like 2 years ago, and definitely post-COVID, is millennials. I mean, there's more millennials than boomers for the first time in, well, ever.
Yeah.
So, and I find it interesting that that's, and millennials are, if I'm going to use a generational cohort generalization that's probably a little bit unsound, but they are more politically engaged than Gen Xers. Maybe they're more politically engaged than boomers, where that's a little bit of a harder thing to say. I don't even know how you measure that, but they're definitely more than Gen Xers. And yet they are still kind of dramatically underrepresented, even at state level politics. Why do you think that is? Is it just this old boy network? Is it weird political habits? Is it extended adolescence? Is it all of it? Like, what's going on here?
I think less people run that don't have money. I think that's like a big issue, and the boomers are holding the wealth, whether we like it or not. So I think it's a lot easier to say, I'm going to run for Congress and take 2 years off when like you don't even really have a job, versus like millennials who sometimes have 2-3 jobs, kids that are very young. I mean, the demands of running for office, which again, this could all be changed. Like it doesn't have to be this way. If we get enough people elected where somehow in the future we're able to overturn Citizens United, this could really change a lot of things. But again, at the city level, one of the reasons why we see so many young people in local New York City politics is because of the city match. So in New York City now, as of I think 2 cycles ago, so I think it's been four years or so, you get for every there are a lot of rules to entry, right? But the rules to entry are fairly not easy, but I mean, if you work hard at your race, you can achieve it, right? I think you need something like you need a couple thousand donations of like $5 or more in your district, right? And if you get that within a certain period of time, which I mean, pretty much most 90% of people do, if you're working decently hard, then you get for every $1 that you raise, you get $9 from the city. So your $20,000 turns into $200,000 for a local election, which that is a game changer, right? Like, and that's why we saw a huge wave of new people, young people getting elected to these seats that we've never seen before. Like, people like, Chiose, I think that's how you say his name. I'm sorry if I mispronounced his name, who's a city councilor in a Brooklyn district that had never, I believe like he was one of the first people of color and the youngest person ever elected to the city council. He was like 22 or 23 when he got elected. People like Tiffany Caban, who was able to run for city council, won her seat as well. Young, queer, Latina woman. That's the type of representation you get when you have an easier barrier to entry like this.
Okay, so there's 2 strategies that we can kind of see now. One is building up more municipal power because there's also the money to fund these things in the cities, frankly. It's a little bit harder if you're in Alabama. But the other thing I would think is that I do think you have to pair that with, particularly as a lot of people have working more remote jobs, with operating in rural districts where they might be a very low barrier to entry, and they could link up to more urban politicians if they framed it right. That's going to be a big if, but you could. Because one thing that is a real problem for both the Democrats in general and any form of leftist in specific is the federalization of the United States, and the fact that while probably the great majority of people have center leftish, well, I don't know, probably it's actually poll after poll kind of verifies this, center leftist orientation, we're in a increasingly not representative federalized system, where, you know, a senator from a place that basically has a prison in it, and that population may or may not count for their population numbers, but they can't vote. This is a common thing in the South. Makes it really unbalanced, particularly in like state legislatures. I mean, I live in Utah, where like the legislature would, you would think it was, I mean, it would still be a red state, but you would think it would be like 60-40, not 85-15. And a lot of that is because there just isn't anybody running in these rural counties to even contest these seats. They're just kind of safely held. And I think that's something for people to look at. And if people are very frustrated with the Democratic Party, and I'm pretty sympathetic to that, it seems like they would at least start looking at not so much Bernie's national campaign, but what he did in Vermont.
Yeah, exactly. One vote at a time by 10 votes.
Yeah, and what was at the time a very red state for New England. And I do think that like there's a lot of not looking at that strategy. And if those two strategies were paired together, you could actually probably do a lot more than you do. And then progressives would have more to bargain with the centrists, and leftists would have more to bargain with progressives, which we currently right now kind of don't, because you're right. We're targeted, but we're not a targeted demographic because we're effectively captured. There's no, like, if I don't like Joe Biden, what am I going to do? I'm going to stay home, right? Well, but I'm not going to probably throw my vote to anyone else who's a threat to Joe Biden or Kamala Harris.
Right.
Whereas, frankly, I don't know, Manchin fans can flip parties.
Mm-hmm.
And they're thus actually not captured. And I don't really, you know, when I tell people about that, you really can't deal with that without changing local election laws. Like, there's no way to do that. So ranked choice voting, what other like local initiatives should people be pushing for?
Well, there's so many, just depending on what state you're in. I mean, every single time we have an election, we always have measures on the ballot, and most of them are extraordinarily important, whether they go one way or the other, right? So I encourage everybody to look at their state specifically. Here in Nevada, the most important that we have right now is Yes on 3, which is going to be, again, ranked choice voting and open primaries, which is going to really change the game out here in terms of, I think it's going to be what will eventually turn us blue. Which is crazy to say after what we've just been through in Nevada. But I do believe we're on that trajectory if we're able to pass that. But, you know, what's really interesting about Bernie Sanders, because I know that Bernie, at least at the federal level, right, was able to bring in these progressives like nobody else ever had done before. And so I think looking to him as a model for where we get to eventually is really important. But I think a lot of what people don't know about Bernie is that, one, he started extremely local and he moved his way up. Two was that there's a whole article on this. I highly encourage people to go read. I believe it was in the New York Times. It was released, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. But it talks about how Bernie started his organizing journey before he even had a thought to run for office. And what he did was that he hung out in project building, so like public housing, in their laundry room, because people in the laundry room of public housing don't usually leave their laundry unattended, right? So like people have a long time to sit there, and like not really do anything. And this was long before like the time of cell phones, right? So like he used to just go into these housing projects and just talk with people and figure out what was on their minds. Doing stuff like that is free. Like there, you can community organize at that level. And I encourage that for people to do that, because I think like just automatically getting up and running for office without really understanding your community is also not the best way to go about it. You need to understand your community. And if you're not a person that's involved and you really hate the system so much, while I always encourage people to attend their city council meetings, maybe that's not your vibe. Maybe the vibe is what Bernie Sanders did, right? But there's always some way that you can get involved to know your community that is both inside and outside of that framework.
I think it's very important. And just, like I said, vibrating radical here, but also a union organizer. And I work with people in very, very conservative teachers unions in very, very conservative district. And I'm often surprised at how much progressive stuff I can do if I just frame it right, but if I explain what I'm aiming for and then listen to their needs. And you do have to sometimes do, okay, horse trade this, or yeah, we realize that we're not going to agree on this because of certain cultural issues, but there's this and this and this we can agree on, and then we can kind of stay at each other's business on these other things.
Yeah.
And that seems antithetical to a lot of radicals and a lot of progressives too. And I worry about that because the other tendency, and I'm gonna almost I'm gonna lose my fire breathing radical cred here, but the other tendency that worries me is media feedback loops and people who are used to only listening to people who have similar views of the world as themselves because it is fed back to them in the form of an algorithm. And often those views are completely disconnected from their local community.
Yes.
Like if I was to judge, if I was to judge what people wanted as a union rep from, I don't know what X or Facebook feeds me, I probably I don't know, be peddling something kind of absurd or maybe even red flag waving.
Yes.
And I know that would not go over well here, even though progressive and even socialist ideas, if pitched at the right level, are not necessarily unpopular even in rural districts. So it does. Now, I think people can go too far with this and think it's just about framing, and I don't really think that. But framing really does matter.
Yes.
And you can't know the frame if your view of the world is from an algorithm niche. So what other things would you tell people to do to kind of break out of that, to bring their ideas to larger groups of people?
So one of the things that I do that I recommend other people do as well is that I have a dummy TikTok account that I only interact with Trump content, and it's a scary place down there, let me tell you. But it really does help to open my eyes to what people actually believe on the other side. And that's really important. Obviously, that's not going to help you at the local level. I think, honestly, the only way that you can really get to understand your community locally is to go out there and have conversations. But if you are in this like progressive echo chamber, or you are in this conservative echo chamber, I really highly encourage having a separate account where you curate the other side. So that way you can really start to see, what the other side is thinking, and that will really help you to understand to help you understand like how to speak to that community. If you want to speak to that community, you need to know what they're saying and how they're saying it.
Yeah, that's a vital thing, and I always, I tell people that, just like you expect your students, I'm a teacher, to code switch, you should also probably expect yourself to code switch when you're talking to different groups of people. And that do not assume that everyone on the other side is necessarily out to kill you. Some of them are. I mean, I'm not going to say that none of them are. Some of them are. And there's some scary stuff you see in that world. But you also can't, unless you engage with that world pretty significantly, you can't tell who's the real danger and who's like caught up in the moment. And there are tells. So it's, I think these are things that people really need to learn. And unfortunately, our current media landscape makes it a little bit harder to do. I guess I'm really thinking about your example in New York. One of the things I'm interested in New York is one of these places where the DSA has an actual caucus and actually does real stuff, as opposed to some other places like most of the country.
Yeah.
On one hand, so my audience knows, I do realize that some of that has a de-radicalizing effect. I don't always think de-radicalizing on everything is good, but on the other hand, they do actually have to make policy and deal with policymakers there in a way that like different progressive and democratic socialist groups don't. And that's a big problem. But I think you've actually given me something to think about that I haven't thought about, why that might be the case. And some of it might be that they have been in a dialogue with the city going all the way back in the 1980s when the DSA was very small, and building this more inclusive electoral structure of which they could actually have some influence. Whereas, like, I don't know, if you try to do that here in Salt Lake City, you'd just be laughed out of the room. But you could build that here slowly. And I think, how, like, I guess this might be my last question, but like, how do you encourage people to have a strategy of patience and organizing?
Oh, that's a tough question because I think all of us at some point get frustrated, and I think like frustration is natural progress. I don't believe that anything is worth doing if it doesn't frustrate you at some level or challenge you, even if it's not frustrate you at some level. But I think to continually recognize and understand that the goal should not be a purity test. The goal should be, how do we support the people that are 90% with us? And this has been my biggest issue with certain chapters of the DSA, not the whole organization. I'm a card-carrying member of the DSA. But there has always been this sort of fight in a lot of places over whether we should have an electoral system or not, essentially, whether we should work within the system or not. And I think that having those conversations in organizing doesn't help us because, when people are attacking AOC because she's not, in the middle of like Nancy Pelosi's office, protesting for like a ceasefire, for example, even though her voting record is so incredibly progressive, is not helpful, right? Like organizing against somebody like AOC is honestly ridiculous. Like I hate to tell people, like, I hate to say that, but it is, right? And like there are other people too. I mean, organizing against like anybody that's in the squad or anybody that's even close to being in the squad is ridiculous because it doesn't help our movement get any further. If you are using purity tests on people like AOC, I hate to say it, but you're helping the Joe Manchins out there. You're helping the Kristen Sinemas, because what ends up happening is that everybody turns their attention to that. And then you have these people making decisions in the dead of night that ruin our movement. So I think frustration is normal, but I don't think that like organizing against progressives that are 90% with us is normal.
So I have a theory about that. And one of the things that I always hear from even the more combative end of the DSA is that we need to hold our electeds accountable. And my response has been, and this cuts in a lot of directions, but you also have to be able to protect them. And right now you can't. You don't have enough people and you don't have enough money, and you need one or the other. And 52 to 100,000, however many people are in the DSA this week, people, while that's a lot for a progressive or socialist group, historically, it's a pretty large number. Maybe one of the largest far-ish left groups in American history, actually. at least going all the way back to like the 1910s. The converse of that is that you're in a country of 320 million.
Yeah.
And the DSA right now seems very turned in on the DSA's own internal problems. And I have always been like, okay, you don't like some of what AOC does. You disagree with her being soft in Palestine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe you have, I mean, I'm not saying maybe you do have legitimate reasons to be angry about the Palestinian stuff. What are you going to, how could you possibly protect her for taking better votes? I don't get a lot of answers for that. And so I guess what I would challenge these people to do is how, and I said it was the last question, but this is actually going to be the last question. How would we build up a infrastructure to be able to protect AOC if she took better stances? Because we've seen what's happened. We had 4 squad members to there's Summerhill, that's good, but then we lost Bowman and Corey Bush.
Yeah.
AIPAC ran against them. But I pointed out to people that AIPAC couldn't do anything about Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar because of the nature of the districts they're in. So, and that's what I mean by protecting. If you can protect them in their district, and you have the people to do that, then there's space for them to take positions that are closer to what you want, or more radical, or more progressive, or whatever. Whereas if you have any weakness at all, in terms of numbers, another advocacy group with a lot more money, which AIPAC has plenty of money, can come in, sweep in, and just run you into the ground, particularly if you've shown any weakness any other place. So how would we build up systems to do that? And I know that's a long-term goal. We're not going to do it in 4 years, but like what kind of steps could we do?
So, I mean, I really think it starts locally, right? Like, I believe that the ground was set for these squad members locally first, right? I know that like the narrative of like, it was a huge upset, and it was, right, for a lot of these folks. But what they don't acknowledge was the local work that happened before them, right? Not saying that the electeds don't, they do, but I mean, I think like the average person that sort of sees like the AOC story or the Ilhan Omar story, like don't really think about all the organizing that happened, city council seat by city council seat, to be able to switch people's minds to make a reality like that happen. So I do think, like, again, getting involved locally is so important, but also like really like sitting back, and I agree with everything you said around how can we expect our elected officials to make more progressive decisions when they don't have support to be able to do that, right? Like when the average person of the party is Nancy Pelosi, and you're so infuriated because AOC won't go out there and frankly make a fool of herself screaming about Palestine, like, you have to be realistic about where people are at in the party right now. And that would honestly destroy her, maybe even her chances of getting reelected, could affect like her relationships within the party to be able to pass progressive legislation that she wants to pass. So, I mean, my whole point here is like, hate the game, not the player, right? Like, all she's doing is trying to push our country forward. And to do that, she also has to speak to her constituents that aren't as progressive, which the Bronx is not. A big part of her district is not very progressive, and she needs to speak to those people too.
Well, I mean, this is the challenge for a lot of people, is like, you have to make progressivism popular beyond, frankly, college educated, mostly white people. And I've seen the Pew data on progressives, and we have progressive views on race, but we're also whiter than the general population as far as like who holds these positions. I also think we're going to have to deal with the fact that we've reached peak college students. So depending on college educated people in the immediate run is going to be a losing proposition.
Yeah.
So learning how to talk to people who are not culturally the same as you is going to be really vital. And
Yeah.
finding people to work with in those communities and what they need is going to be really vital. And I don't care how radical you are, and like I said, I'm pretty radical. It's something you have to do.
Yeah.
And thank you. Where can people find your information? I'm very interested in people looking up this information you're making available for free to how to play these systems.
Yeah, definitely. You can look me up at ZC Sanchez on TikTok. I post content every day on there. And then we also have our Soul Strategies pages. So we're on Instagram, Soul Strategies, like the sole of your shoe. And we are also on Facebook as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I hope people look up your work and start, I don't know, trying to change their local politics, because I'm not going to introduce a new topic right now, but I am thinking about the fact that there is this turn against localism in the aughts, which I think made some sense because people only focusing on like local stuff in the 90s.
Yeah.
But I think it maybe people learned the wrong direction, the wrong lesson there, and kind of just ignore local stuff. And then there's media incentives for that, as I explained to people. I have a pretty large, not a huge, but a pretty large worldwide audience. But my audience in my own city is like 50 people.
Oh, wow.
And whereas my audience, I have more listeners in Europe than I do in Salt Lake. And my biggest market is actually New York. And so one of the things I tell people is podcasting and X, and even though I do it, and I do think you have to do it, but that's about building networks. It is not about doing your local work. You can't really do your local work through these diffused international media, things, because they're just being thrown out to the ether, and yet tons of people might be inspired by them. But if I was to say show up at this point in Salt Lake City by listening to my show, 5 people would show up.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just something to think about. And I think people's engagement on TikTok and stuff, and I think, that's good. I don't want to say people oh, don't do the internet. I'm not one of those people. But it also wouldn't make any sense for my show. But it is important that people remember that this is a way of networking or doing education or building allegiances. It is not the same and cannot be the same as being involved in the ground in your own city and your own state.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope people check her out, and I will put those links in the show notes. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.